All right, more causes of the American Revolution. We had seen after the French and Indian War, the British gave a series of tax measures to the Americans to try to raise money to pay off the French and Indian War. The American colonists, most of them were very upset by these tax increases, claiming that it was not a very good time to bring the tax increases to America because of the depression, the economic downturn after the war. Americans, many of them also thought they had, sort of paid for the war by helping Britain fight the war. But more than that, all that, the Americans, their battle cry was no taxation to representation. No taxation without representation. That is, we're not going to pay taxes to people we didn't vote for. And since Americans had no votes in Parliament, therefore they weren't going to pay Parliament the tax measures that Parliament said that we should pay. And of course, the colonists instituted a series of measures. One of the more successful measures were boycotts that did manage to get rid of the Stamp Act and this Townsend Acts. Although, even though they were successful in getting rid of those two tax laws, by that time there had been violence on the street of Boston with the Boston Massacre and riots. Of course, during this time, American colonists started working together with the Stamp Act Congress, where 9 of the 13 colonies joined together to help think about how they could do away with these terrible tax laws. So eventually, the British Parliament did away with all the taxes, and then comes the Tea Act of 1773, which in many cases is a lot of confusion on both sides. The British government is simply trying to prevent a company that pays a lot of taxes from going broke, the British East India Tea Company. The colonists, however, have lost trust in their government. They believe it's just a big conspiracy theory to help them pay taxes. Plus, unfortunately, on the other side, the king did insist on that 1 penny tax on the tea, and that gave some Americans the cry again of no taxation without representation. Eventually, when those tea shipments arrived in Boston, the colonists, some of them, the Sons of Liberty, boarded the ships and tossed the tea overboard, and that really angered the British Parliament because not only was this an act basically against the British government, but it was also an act against a private company, the British East India Company, and destruction of private property was seen as a very serious crime. And the British government responded with the Intolerable or Coercive Acts, which basically shut down the port of Boston until the tea was paid for. The Massachusetts Charter was canceled, and therefore there'd be no more voting for elected leaders and making your own local laws. Instead, a royal governor would be appointed, and basically they'd become sort of a dictator. Also, some people would be sent to England for trial instead of having trials in the British colonies of America. And of course, on top of that, you also have the Quebec Acts, which really set up a government for Canada, but also really prevent American westward movement as well. Basically, again, keeping American colonists on the eastern side of the Appalachian Mountains. So all of this has, of course, really angered colonists. By this time, 12 of the 13 colonies are working together in the First Continental Congress meeting in Philadelphia. They do two things. They urge American colonists to boycott again. Hopefully that boycott would be successful. But if not, they tell the colonies to get their militias ready, their part-time armies ready. Because these militiamen, these colonists might have to fight for their rights as Englishmen, including the right not to be taxed by people they didn't vote for. So that's basically where we left off. By mid-1774, the British had sent over a new royal governor. In fact, his name was General Thomas Gage. He was a general in command of all military forces in North America. So he already had a job with the British in North America. He was in charge with British military forces in what we now know as Canada and what we now know as the Caribbean islands, and also in what we now know as the British colonies along the eastern seaboard. Gage is basically going to try to take those troops and move them all to Boston, about 4,000 of them, to keep order. But Gage also has to come up with a way to prevent a war. With 4,000 troops in Boston, the the British, if the colonials mobilize all their militias, the British troops will probably be outnumbered, and bad things could happen. So General Gage had fought the French and Indian War here. He'd come over from England to fight the French and Indian War. When he was fighting the French and Indian War, he fell in love with North America. He decided to stay. He married an American wife, and so he had ties to America. The last thing he really wanted to do was order his army to start shooting down civilians in the street or starting a war. That's the last thing he wanted. So somehow he had to figure out a way to prevent the war. And as he thought about it, what could he do? Well, I guess he could go around trying to take all the guns away from the colonists, but unfortunately for him, Massachusetts and New England was probably the most heavily armed area of North America. The British colonists here in America had 150 years worth of time to buy guns, to get guns ready, to use them for hunting, to use them for militia purposes. And in Massachusetts, of course, all able-bodied men, basically from 18 to about 55 or 60, had to have a weapon so they could be part of the militia. And even so, during this time period, the Massachusetts Assembly and other assemblies had started buying men that didn't have guns. They started buying guns for those men. So basically going around door to door would probably not work very well. The colonists probably would not just give you their guns. You tried to take them, they'd probably hide them somewhere or probably shoot you while you tried to look for them. So Gage, again, starts thinking and says, well, maybe if I can't take away their guns, I can take away their ammunition. Of course, at that time, the ammunition is basically the round musket balls, generally made of lead, but you can make them of other things as well. But then, of course, Gage realizes that they're pretty easy to make. I mean, you can basically melt down almost any metal that melts into a musket ball and fire it off your gun. And even if you didn't have a musket ball, you could probably stuff down nails and other things to fire off that musket. At that point, his idea turned to gunpowder. And this was a colonial weakness because the colonials did not make their own gunpowder. They imported it. They brought it in from England. So Gage almost immediately realizes that if he could stop colonists from getting gunpowder and then take away most of their gunpowder, the colonists wouldn't be really able to defend themselves with their guns. Each gun would only have a few shots. Sure, colonists had gunpowder at home, but that was usually just enough to go hunting. It wasn't enough to fight a war. So the first thing Gage did was he ordered that no more gunpowder shipments were made to America. And the second thing he started to do was to plot how to take at least a large amount of gunpowder away from the colonists. And almost immediately, his thoughts fell upon the nearest gunpowder magazine, the building that held a lot of gunpowder for the colonists, and that was only about 20 miles outside of Boston. And so Gage decides to send his troops to that building, which is now shown on your screen, and collect the gunpowder, bring it back to Boston, where, of course, the British soldiers could place it under lock and key and prevent the colonists from having it. So on that wonderful morning of the powder alarm, September 1st, 1774, about 260 regulars with a lot of wagons leave Boston very early in the morning. They arrive at the gunpowder house even before really there's much light, and they have to wait around for there to be enough light to actually go in and remove the gunpowder, because obviously, you don't want to enter into this gunpowder warehouse and light some candles because that might possibly set up the gunpowder. So eventually by daybreak, they started loading the gunpowder in the wagons, and by noon, they were back in Boston with this important supply of colonial gunpowder. So it seemed at first Gage's mission was a success, except he soon realized it was not exactly a rousing success, because by later that afternoon, there were estimated about 20,000 militia troops marching towards Boston. False alarms had been spread that the British had started a war. The British had shot down people in the streets because they, people had seen the British troops marching outside of Boston, and these rumors quickly circulated around Massachusetts and the rest of New England. And so by that evening, it's estimated 20 to 30,000 militia troops were on their way to Boston to fight a war that really never existed. Now, when those militia troops found out that there was no war going on, they went back to their homes. But if you're General Gage with 4,000 troops in Boston, you have to be very concerned, because in just a few hours, the colonials apparently could summon like 5 to 6 or 7 times the amount of men that you have in your entire command. And certainly if you send out some of your British troops to do something like this again, and they are surrounded overwhelmingly by a large number of militia, those militia troops are, I'm sorry, your redcoats, your British troops are going to have to surrender, or they're going to be massacred. So from now on, Gage starts planning in secret. But at the very same time, the colonists are also somewhat mad because their precious gunpowder has been taken away. And so at this time, the Sons of Liberty start a sort of a spy network in Boston, headed up by a silversmith named Paul Revere. And the spy network's job is to keep track of what the British troops are doing, where they might be going, and to try to stop another expedition like the one that just stolen their gunpowder. Now, they didn't have to wait long for that next expedition to arrive. So again, the powder alarm was, of course, very near Boston. They could march the troops quickly back and forth to Boston and back before the colonists could do very much. At least that was the plan. But the Portsmouth alarm was a little bit different. Portsmouth was in New Hampshire, which was a couple of colonies up from Massachusetts. It was much further away from Boston, about 60 plus miles by road. And the General Gage had been contacted and said the fort had a lot of gunpowder and weapons, but very few troops. In fact, the Fort William and Mary, was actually being used as a hospital for convalescing British soldiers that had been shot and or have been wounded in some way or have been injured, and they're basically in the fort recovering. So it wasn't like the fort was well defended, but there was a lot of gunpowder left over from the French Indian War. There were a lot of cannons there. There were a lot of guns there from the French Indian War. And so certainly Gage was concerned that the colonists might try to go get this gunpowder. And so Gage met with his officers and started a plan to send some ships up from Boston to sail to Portsmouth, to arrive at the fort, and then bring this gunpowder back. However, that meeting was quickly well known by Paul Revere's spy network, and they reported back to him what had been happening. That very evening, Paul got on his horse and rode 60 miles up the road through the night to Portsmouth to warn the local inhabitants the British troops were on their way. Now, 60 miles by night's bad enough on a horse, but there was a blizzard. There was a storm. There was a snowstorm that very evening as well. So Paul Revere on a horse, freezing weather, the winds are pretty high, 20 to 30 miles per hour. There's ice and snow falling on him and basically blown in his face, and he's riding a horse down this, of course they weren't paved, they didn't have concrete, so they're dirt pathway toward Portsmouth. He arrived the next morning, he contacted the local Sons of Liberty, and that very day they basically swarmed in the fort and took it over, which was actually not that difficult because, again, there were only a couple of British troops there. They basically tied up the British troops and basically took the gunpowder and a few of the guns with them. And by the time the ships arrived, with 3 days later that General Gage had sent, the British troops inside the fort had been tied up for several days, and they were really mad. Now the British government in the form of General Gage was really mad because the colonists had taken away this gunpowder that he was hoping to bring back to Boston and secure. So the Portsmouth alarm showed that the spy network, the Sons of Liberty and Paul Revere and his spy network of apprentices in Boston was working. So many of these spies were your age. Many of them were young apprentices learning from their master, meaning the master wig maker, the master printer, or the boss, you might call them today. And these were young people who, of course, were spending maybe 4 or 5 years learning a trade. So eventually, one day, they could become a master printer or a master craftsman in some way. And so Paul Revere realized that these young people would probably not be noticed by the British Army as much as, perhaps adults sneaking around. So he actually mobilized the young people of Boston to become his spies. And this time it worked pretty well. Naturally, General Gage was a little mad, but again, there's a lot of other gunpowder around that he could collect, and so he decided to try again. So there's Fort William and Mary. You can still visit today in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Of course, the lighthouse was not there at the time. but the fort itself was still there. And you can see the trip is a little bit longer, certainly long by road, a little bit shorter by sea, and of course a little bit easier by sea if you're sailing on a vessel. But again, Paul Revere, not only an excellent silversmith, but an excellent horseman as well, managed to do that in a single night, again, without a paved road and without highway lights, basically in the dark, riding through a snowstorm, which is an amazing journey in itself. So that brings us to a place just north of Boston called Salem. Now, this was not this very same Salem where they had the witchcraft trials. That was called Salem Village, where they accused people. Now, some people in Salem town were accused, but basically most of the trouble was in Salem town. In fact, so bad was their reputation after accusing people of being witches, they actually changed their name to Danvers. So by 1775, the place where the witches had been tried and convicted and hung, that place was actually called Danvers. Now today, if you go to Salem, Danvers is actually part of Greater Salem because Salem, Massachusetts has grown so large, it basically took it over. But at the time, they were a little bit different. Salem, at the time and today, still a port city, still near the water. And General Gage was informed by some of his assets, some of his spies that he had, that the colonials had a large amount of weapons, cannons and guns, etc., that were stored in Salem to be used in case there was a war. And so General Gage decides to send a ship up to seize these arms and ammunition and bring them back to Boston. Now the ship in question, the troops, when they sailed on the ship, when the ship actually arrived, they had about 240 redcoats, 240 regulars in the ship, but they were not visible. They were basically below decks. So when the ship arrived at Salem, it looked like a cargo ship. And the ship arrived on a Saturday evening, and next day, basically while the colonists were at church, the British troops would then come off the ship, go down the road, over a bridge, march a mile, find the weapons, march back, put them in the ship, and sail away before the people were even out of church. So that was the British government plan. That was General Gage's plan. So that's Saturday evening worked pretty well. The ship arrived. It looked like a regular cargo ship. It tied up. The next morning, people were at church. This was Puritan New England, and of course, at that time in 1775, still very religious population. In fact, probably every soul except maybe for a town watchman was at the church. And the British troops then got off the ship and started marching through town. But for some inexplicable reason, of course, their boots were bad enough marching down the pathway, but apparently the officers were keeping tune or keeping track of their men to keep them in step. And of course, their voices were rather loud as they marched their men down the road. And of course, the people at church, they're trying to hear the preacher, and they go, "Hey, preacher, could you speak up? We can't hear you over the British troops outside." "What? British troops are outside?" And of course, the people in the churches rush outside to see what the problem is. Nevertheless, the British troops do march to a small river, and all now they have to do is go over a drawbridge and go about a mile down the road, and they'll find all the arms and ammunition. But at that point, someone from the other side of the drawbridge raises the drawbridge up. And so now the British have stopped because they can't get across. But, of course, the British officer immediately orders the man, "Lower the drawbridge. I order you to lower the drawbridge in the name of the king." And you can guess how that went over with the people that had already raised the drawbridge. They didn't even respond. The bridge stayed up. But nevertheless, as the officer was, ordering them to lower the drawbridge, the officer looked down and saw some boats, some small boats that were on this side of the bank, on his side of the bank, and said, "Oh, no wonder, hey, don't wonder, men, don't worry. Well, you just use those boats to row over and get the, hey, you colonials with axes, hey, stop chopping those boats up. Hey, stop. Of course, the colonials raced to the area, chopped holes in the boats, and now the British could not move forward across the water. Even worse, now for the British troops, they couldn't move backward either because a large crowd had gathered, including many of the militia. And it looked like there might be a firefight. It looked like there might be some violence. Fortunately, town leaders, preacher, and the officers worked out some agreements. And the agreement was basically that if the bridge was lowered, the British troops promised just to march a mile down the road. If they found no weapons, they would march back on the bridge and get back on the ship and sail away. And so that was the agreement. And so they lowered the drawbridge. The British troops marched a mile. And of course, they didn't find the weapons because by that time the weapons had been moved. The British troops marched back across their broad drawbridge. By this time, of course, they were surrounded by colonial militia and a large crowd of citizenry. As they were passing by the road, the path to go back to the ship, a two-story dwelling, a young lady, Sarah Terrett, leaned out and basically yelled at them, go back and tell your masters he has sent you on a fool errand. Do you think we were raised in the woods to be frightened by owls? That is basically, she's yelling that, we're not scared. And one of the British troopers, frustrated, of course, the mission had failed, raised his musket and took aim at her. And good old Sarah, her next words were, go ahead and shoot, but I doubt it. In other words, she was basically saying, you don't even have the courage to shoot me. That is, you're a coward. And sure enough, the British troops continued marching. No shots were fired. They got back on their ships. They sailed back to Boston, another mission that had failed. So you really have to think, if you're the British government, if you're the British commander, if you're General Gage here in Boston, how are you going to stop this rebellion? If there's going to be a rebellion, how are you going to stop it when even unarmed women aren't afraid of your soldiers? That was a really good question. That was precipitated by the Salem alarm in Salem, Massachusetts, where again the colonists, thanks to advanced warning, thanks to that spy network that was set up by Paul Revere, was successful in thwarting the British government efforts to seize guns and ammunition. Of course, there's a nice story, Sarah Terrett, who there are many heroes of the American Revolution, but America has basically always been a nation for many reasons, a place where people have come to get away from authority. Those religious groups came to get away from the religious church authorities in England, and many of the poor in England came here not just to get rich, but also to get away from the British authorities who had made them mad. So America has been a place and is a place where defying authority is sometimes somewhat commonplace, as you notice even today. The next, Middlesex alarm. Sorry, it's not like it sounds. Middle section, the middle section alarm. So areas were often divided into sections. The first section, the second section, the third section, and sometimes the second section was called the middle section, the Middlesex. So the Middlesex alarm, April 18th through 19th, 1775. So General Gage is again informed that there's a large stockpile of weapons and gunpowder at a place called Concord, Massachusetts. And so General Gage decides to send his men out again to Concord to seize the arms and ammunition. Of course, he realizes that it's a dangerous mission, especially if the colonists get alarmed. So his plan is basically to send them out at night. That is, he'll start his mission at night. The men will march through the night. At daybreak, they'll be in Concord, and they'll be able to march back to Boston before noon. And that way, even if the colonial militias are summoned, there simply won't be many of them to actually start a war against the British. So, of course, that he also, of course, has to be very careful, because by this time he knows there's a spy network, Paul Revere's, and so in the evening, of course, earlier that morning, the British General Gage and his troops had held a meeting. Not his troops, but his commanders had held a meeting to decide on this strategy. And so later that evening, about 8, 9 o'clock, the British troops who've just come in, and of course they're getting ready for bed, They're summoned by their officers, and they're basically told to come out the back way, not to get information, but to go down to the docks where small boats will row them to the opposite shore, what they call the Cambridge shore. And that there the troops will form and start marching overland. Now, the colonials know something up, but the British government, the British commander, British Gage, has been pretty good about keeping the apprentices and other spies out of the process this time. And so there's a real question about what's happening that evening. Paul Revere asked his friend, one of the doctors in town, to see if he could use one of his contacts with General Gage to see what the plan might be. And the doctor soon reports back that his contact has reported this plan. The British troops, intend to march down the road to march through Lexington, at which point they'll also, by the way, arrest two people, Sam Adams, the head of the Sons of Liberty, and a guy named John Hancock, who happens to be the richest merchant in the Americas at the time. And one of the reasons he's rich is he's a smuggler. He uses his ships and connections to basically smuggle the stuff he brings into America from the Caribbean and other places around the world, and he basically smuggles it in. He doesn't pay his taxes, in other words. And John Hancock has been using his money to help fund the Sons of Liberty. So General Gage has ordered their arrest, and hopefully if he can capture the head of the Sons of Liberty and the money man behind the Sons of Liberty, that could do real damage to the Sons of Liberty and the spy network the colonials have. And then, of course, the British troops will march on the way to Concord and arrive in the morning, get the stuff, and march all the way back by afternoon. And the contact reports all this to the doctor, and the doctor reports back to Paul Revere. Now, no one's quite sure of who the contact was, but many historians suspect it was the general's wife, General Gage's wife, his American wife. There's a number of reasons why historians suspect this, especially apparently shortly thereafter they had a falling out and she was sent back to England on a ship, and basically they never reunited after that point. But nevertheless, the colonials now know what's happening. So, of course, Paul Revere is going to spring up and he needs to, he's going to be riding the roads that night just like he has before at Fort William and Mary and the Portsmouth Alarm. The Sons of Liberty have other riders that evening also. Another one of those riders is William Dawes, who will go attempt to go out the main road of Boston, even though, of course, that's closed down by the military. Paul Revere has already set up a plan. They already realized that the people in Boston and the Sons of Liberty in Boston already realized that they might be have knowledge of information, but if they couldn't get out of Boston, they wouldn't be able to do anything about it. So from the Cambridge shore, from across the town and in Charlestown, the Sons of Liberty had watchmen that were watching Boston every evening after the sun went down. And they were told to watch the tallest church, the tallest church steeple in Boston. And if they saw lights, that meant the British troops were going to be marching out of Boston. One if by land and two if by sea. So again, if they saw one light, the British would be marching out the neck of Boston. If they saw two lights, the British are going to be using some boats somehow to sneak out of Boston, and that would alert other people outside of Boston about what was happening. So Paul Revere alerted his spy network that what was happening. They immediately went to the church and started setting up the lights. Meanwhile, Paul Revere went back home. He collected his supplies. He went down to a small bay area near Boston, and he's looking for the boat. The Sons of Liberty have one. They already have a small boat for him and someone to row him over, and so they row him across. There's a British warship, but fortunately, the British warship is sort of the town of Boston. It's a full moon, but the moon is shining through Boston, so it creates shadows on the water, which means the sentries on the British warship can't see really any small boats crossing that evening. And so Paul Revere gets across There's again more Sons of Liberty waiting for him. Again, they've already been alarmed. They've already been forewarned. This is coming by the lights of Boston. In fact, they've already sent out one rider even before Paul Revere gets there. That they get him a horse, and Paul Revere takes off down the road towards Lexington and Concord. Now his job is basically to warn Hancock and Adams. The British troops are going to arrest them. His job is really not to get to Concord. That's really the Sons of Liberty's job. That's somebody else's job. Meanwhile, William Dawes is riding another route to the same area. So as they're riding, the alarm is already being sent out. William Dawes gets out the neck of Boston. Paul Revere is riding down the road. He does, in fact, stop at a few locations to basically tell the leaders of some of the Sons of Liberty groups, some of the militia groups, what's happening. So as he's riding down the road, he knows particular houses to stop at. Despite some movies to the contrary, he's not just riding down the road shouting at houses in the middle of the night because people would be asleep. So he actually stops at some houses and notifies these leaders what's happening, and then he gets back on his horse and keeps riding. Now, he keeps riding till he reaches Lexington. And he reaches Lexington very early in the morning, about midnight or 1 a.m. in the morning. Now, by that time, the British troops, they've gotten across. The British troops themselves, who have been awakened during the night, they've been sent across on small boats, but they've been waiting. They haven't moved yet because the British Navy is supposed to supply them with food so they can march. And the British Navy is a little late in getting to the rendezvous. And so the British soldiers who had been up since 8 p.m., 9 p.m., rowing across, they basically reached the opposite shore about 10, but they're still stuck there. They haven't even begun marching yet. And Paul Revere is already at Lexington warning the two people, Sam Adams and John Hancock, British troops are on their way. Meanwhile, William Dawes shows up a few minutes later. He is also ridden down the road. Now, he doesn't actually know the leaders, so if you look at the path he rode, that area is almost one of the last areas to get the warning about the British troop movements that evening, simply because even though William Dawes was a brave man and he was riding that evening and he was risking his life to warn Sam Adams and John Hancock, he actually was not part of the sort of the spy network Paul Revere had set up. So he didn't actually know some of the leaders along that road, and so he never stopped for anyone. But nevertheless, two of them warned Sam Adams and John Hancock to clear out, and they started their preparations to leave. John Hancock Sam Adams was one of the first ones to leave, and John Hancock, who's a rich guy, he was preparing his special carriage and other things like that in order to leave as well. Meanwhile, by this time, Paul Revere and William Dawes decide to go warn Concord. Now, that's not their job. They've done their job. They could have just said, okay, we're finished for the night. But instead, they decide to warn Concord just in case nobody else has. So they get on their horses and start riding down the road to Concord. Along the way, they meet Dr. Prescott coming into Lexington. Dr. Prescott is from Concord, but he's coming back to Lexington for some business. And he says, "Oh, I'll lead you back to Concord." So the three of them go down the road to Concord, but they don't get very far when unfortunately for them, they see a British cavalry patrol on the road. So the colonials are not the only ones who have spies. They're not the only ones who have planned for this night. The British government has planned. General Gage has planned for this night. Early that morning, even before he told his troops, he had sent out some cavalry detachments, some people on horses, and their job was simply to ride up to important road networks, and they were to spend the day at an inn or a pub or something, maybe drinking a few drinks or sleeping or something. But then during the night, their job was to stop everybody going down the roads, because you might not know who might be going down the roads. It may be just an innocent civilian going down the road at night, but it could be a spy of Paul Revere's. So this British cavalry patrol had the road blocked, had already captured a few people, and then all of a sudden these three horsemen, Dawes, Revere, and Prescott, run sort of almost right up on them. And Paul Revere basically shouts a warning to the other two. The other two break away to the countryside. Paul Revere spurs his horse and rides directly towards the British patrol. And of course, the British patrol is so stunned that someone's like charging them. The British patrol doesn't even go looking for the other two. So unfortunately for Mr. Dawes, just a mile or so from town, his horse throws him off into the forest area, and he spends the night sleeping there. Dr. Prescott, however, does manage to make it to Concord, where he warns them British troops are on their way. Meanwhile, Paul Revere is captured. And the British officer in charge of these cavalry guys says, hey, this is the famous Paul Revere that's always messing up our plans. And he basically says, okay, Paul Revere, you're going to tell us what you know tonight, or we're going to blow your brains out. And they literally put a gun to his head and say, tell us what you know, we're going to blow your brains out. And Paul Revere tells them what he knows. He tells them the entire top secret British plan that evening, the British soldier plan that evening, General Gage's plan. Top secret, but he knows it all. He tells them when the troops are supposed to march, which units the troops are from, what their primary mission is, what their secondary mission is. And of course, this cavalry patrol is so stunned that Paul Revere knows these top secret plans. They're like shocked, they're speechless. At this point, Paul Revere throws in a little something else that's really not true. But he says, you know, our guys know that your troops are coming, and they've set up ambushes. They're going to ambush your British soldier friends and wipe them out. And just about that time, a few minutes later, the British patrol hears gunshots in the direction of Lexington. Now, probably what had happened at Lexington was a couple of men had gone into a tavern for a drink. But before you go into the tavern, you actually have to clear your guns. You can't take them in with you unless they're unarmed. And so they probably just shot their guns off into the ground and went into the pub to have a few drinks. Those are probably the shots the British soldiers, the British cavalry detachment that had captured Paul Revere heard. But Paul Revere just told them there's going to be an ambush. And these soldiers are saying, hey, our soldier friends are walking in ambush. We have to do something, but we have all these civilians. What can we do? I know, let's just leave these civilians here and go warn our soldier friends. And so the cavalry detachment takes Paul Revere's horse and rides off towards Lexington to try to warn their men they're walking into an ambush, even though there is no ambush. Paul Revere immediately starts heading towards Lexington himself. He basically runs down the road to Lexington. Now he arrives just about 5 a.m. in the morning, just as the British troops from Boston are marching up. The 700 British troops from Boston are finally marching up the road to Lexington. And by the way, Paul Revere runs to the house that Adams and Hancock were. Of course, Sam Adams has already left, but Hancock, he's just strolling down like there's no worry at all. And so Paul, says, hurry, get in your coach and leave. The British troops are, here. And Hancock says, oh, by the way, as he's, Hancock is being driven off in his coach. By the way, I've left some important secret papers upstairs. Do you mind hiding them for me? And Paul Revere says, sure, no problem. Get away, get away. And so Paul Revere runs up the stairs and he pulls down this heavy chest, so heavy, he probably should have 2 or 3 guys, but there's just him. Pulls down this heavy chest from upstairs, pulls it across the street, and it's just at that point the British troops march into town. Now in town, about 60 of the militia have lined up blocking the road. The British troops line up about 50 yards away. And at that point, the officer in charge calls for the militia to move aside, to disperse. In fact, I think his exact words were, disperse, ye rebels, disperse. So the militia, of course, there's not a war going on, starts to move back from the road. But at that moment, a shot is fired. Don't know who's fired the shot. Could have been on purpose, could have been an accident, could have been someone clearing their gun nearby. What we do know is the British troops immediately lower their weapons and fire into the militia, who, by the way, by this time is clearing the road. Some of the militia have already turned their backs and are walking away, and so some of these militia guys are actually shot in the back. The British troops, of course, then fire their first volley. Of course, the militia troops start running away. Some turn and shoot back. The British troops start basically running towards the militia with their long bayonets on their rifles to kill those people. And the British officer realizes what's happened, and he orders the drummers to start drumming the drums and recall the troops. The troops eventually are recalled. The militia is dispersed, and the British officer recognizes this is bad because there are 8 people dead on the ground. There's more wounded. The British open fire, on these colonists. Obviously, this will not be a good thing. But the British officer realizes that he has Major Pitcairn. The British officer realizes he has a job to do, and so he says, "Men, we have to continue marching towards Concord." And so they continue marching towards Concord. Of course, by this time, the warning that the British troops are marching, is even spread to the Connecticut border. I mean, it's spread outside of Massachusetts. And obviously, people are gathering up their militias and starting to march the area. But nevertheless, they start marching towards Concord, and they arrive at Concord about 7 a.m. They then look around Concord. They find some cannons. They basically burn the pieces of wood that sort of help the cannons move, so the colonials won't be able to move the cannons. They find some gunpowder. They find some ammunition, some musket balls, and they toss that in the nearby lake. Meanwhile, another group, about 100 or so British soldiers, have gone to the North Bridge by the Concord River. And they went to the North Bridge to make sure that militia units don't move into town and bother their soldier friends who are in town. So the North Bridge, as it's called. And as the British troops arrive at the North Bridge, militia units are basically on the other side of the river on high ground, and they're looking at town. And by this time, unfortunately for the British troops at the river by the bridge, the colonials start to notice smoke from their town of Concord. What has happened was, when the British troops basically burned the cannon carriages, the sort of wooden platform the cannons are on, that fire spread to some buildings. And so now there's a fire in Concord. And the militia, who's from Concord, they're all thinking, hey, they're burning down my town. And so naturally, the Concord militia starts moving down towards this bridge. The British troops on the bridge are compacted in what's called a street firing order, where you can fire a lot of ammunition at one place at one time. Unfortunately for them, the militia is sort of spread out. Even though they're coming down the road, the path to the bridge, they're still sort of spread out. So as the militia approaches, the British officer in charge of the troops orders them to stop approaching. When the militia does not stop approaching, he orders his men to start firing. So it's basically, at this time, about 400 militia guys against 100 of these redcoats on the bridge. But after the first volley, the militia start to shoot back at the British redcoats. And the militia have actually been practicing their shooting, just like the Continental Congress told them. And pretty soon, a lot of the people at the bridge are lying wounded. A couple of them are dead. And the British soldiers start to run away, and they start to run back into town, and the militia follows them. Now in town, there's nothing more to find. There's nothing more to destroy, because most of the important stuff has already been taken out of town. Obviously, if you get many hours of advance notice that the British troops are coming, you've already taken the stuff out of town. Duh. So the British troops didn't find very much. And now they started to fire, and now the militias are angry, and now these soldiers recognize they're deep in Massachusetts, and they recognize that because of what happened this morning, that there's going to be a lot of militia between them and home, between them and Boston. And so by noontime, noon, they start to move out of Concord and start move down that road to Lexington and back to Boston. Of course, by this time, there's lots of militia on the road. There's thousands and thousands and thousands of militia groups pouring to the area. And, of course, this is a modern road in Massachusetts. And you notice even the modern roads, even though they're paved, there's forest off to either side, and there's also a stone wall off to either side. Here's something that was basically taken in the late 1800s, early 1900s by film, pretty much the way it looked back in 1775. So many houses were nearby the road. They had these stone walls because the New England area was basically, because of the last ice age, the ice had pushed all these stones into New England soil, and if you wanted to farm anything in New England, you had to take these stones out. And what do you do with all these stones you take out of the soil to grow stuff? You actually have to put them somewhere. So people started making these stone walls, which, by the way, in 1775 were great if you're the colonial militia, because you can hide behind these stone walls, and the British troopers' musket balls, of course, bounce off. Even better if you're in these houses, and you see the British troops marching down the road. You don't even have to leave your house. You just open a window, you lean out with your gun, and you start blasting them. And so the poor British soldiers, who, of course, they haven't signed up for this mission. It wasn't their choice to come on this mission. It was the officers' choices, the British government's choices. But now these British soldiers are marching down these narrow roads, being attacked from all directions, from the front, from the rear, etc. They're shooting back. Unfortunately, the British soldiers have only brought their standard 36 rounds of ammunition. That is, they've only brought gunpowder and musket balls for 36 shots. And it's a long way back to Boston. And so now they're shooting and they're being shot at, etc. And they get near Lexington, and a lot of them have been wounded. A lot of them don't have any ammunition left. And even the officers are saying, if we get to Lexington and there's more colonial militia there, we're just going to have to surrender. I mean, there's nothing else we can do. But fortunately, as they get to Lexington, cannon shots ring out. And the British officers look up, and they see a British Army flag flying over Lexington. General Gage had sent reinforcements. Just after these guys left, early the next morning, General Gage recognizes that 700 redcoats, especially if the countryside's alarmed, is not going to be a big enough force. So he sent out another 1,000 troops under Lord Percy. And he sent those troops out. Then an hour or two later, he says, we sent those troops out with their 36 rounds, but if there's a lot of shooting, they're going to run out of these musket balls pretty quick. I tell you what, why don't we send some wagons full of gunpowder and musket balls, and they can go down the road to Lexington as well. Now, they're not going down the same road Paul Revere went down. They're not going down that same road the British troops in the morning went down. They're going down the road that's the most direct route. That is, if you leave Boston by land, there's a direct route to Lexington. Of course, it's a lot faster than rowing yourself across to the other side and doing that road. So Lord Percy has arrived at Lexington, and he's brought a couple of his cannons. And the cannons boom out, boom, boom, boom. And the British troops, that have been being shot at all this time, these 700 original troops rush into Lexington. Oh, thank goodness, thank goodness you saved us. Unfortunately, the extra ammunition wagons, they never got very far outside of Boston. Nope. Even though the militias were headed towards Lexington and Concord, there were some other militia troops, sort of like you might call reserve troops today. These were older guys that technically were not part of the militia anymore, because technically after 50, you weren't part of the militia. And you have to remember, life expectancy was a little bit shorter back then, and so you didn't have as many people living into the 50s, 60s, and 70s as you do today. So these men were 60-year-old guys, and they had some old weapons around, and as the younger men went out of town, headed to Lexington, they go, hey, maybe we might go down the road and see what's there. And what was there was a couple of ammunition wagons. And these old guys, these 65, 66-year-old guys, they pointed their weapons at these 18 young British troopers, plus their sergeant, and said, stop the wagons, surrender. And of course, the British troops just laughed at them and kept on going, at which time these 60, 65-year-old guys opened fired. And their aim was pretty good for being advanced in years. They managed to shoot the sergeant, a couple of his men, and the others just ran off. Six of the British soldiers surrendered to them right then and there. The other men just ran off. And so the extra ammunition never actually got to Lexington for the British Army to use. So now you have 1,000 men with 36 rounds, and now you have 700 men with basically no bullets. which means the 1,000 new arrivals, they basically share their ammunition with other ones, which means you have even less ammunition per soldier. And now, even worse, there's no extra cannonballs for the cannons. So now you have to march down the road back to Boston, and again, there's more and more militia arriving at all times. So as this column of British troops march down the road to Boston, they eventually reach a point where they have a decision to make. One road leads directly to Boston. It's the shortest route. The other road goes all the way to Charlestown, where Paul Revere and the soldiers had been rowed across, that previous morning. Of course, most of the soldiers want to go down the road direct and get back to Boston as soon as possible. But the officers decide to head back to Charlestown. And it's a lucky thing they did, because just past that little diversion road, the Americans had basically torn up the bridge that was over the river. And so if the British troopers had gone down the main road to Boston, they would have been cut off from Boston, and they would have been surrounded on side, and they would have been massacred. Fortunately, the British troops do make it back to Boston. Well, they basically make it back to the Charleston shore, where the British Navy warships, because again, the Charleston shore is basically sort of a peninsula, and the British warships can sort of sail up near the coast, and they basically use their heavy cannons, and their heavy cannons basically shoot over the British soldiers in Charlestown, and so the Americans can't actually advance on the British soldiers. So all through the night, the wounded are taken to Boston, and the next morning they're taken to Boston, and the next day the rest of the soldiers are taken back to Boston. So eventually, many years later, in 1860, someone writes a nice poem about this called Paul Revere's Ride. Listen, my children, you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. It was the 18th of April of 75, and hardly a man now alive who remembers that famous day and year. And the last part, particularly interesting, so through the night rode Paul Revere, and so through the night went his cry of alarm to every Middlesex village and farm, a cry of defiance, not of fear, a voice in the darkness and knock at the door, a word that shall echo forevermore. For born on that night wind of the past, through all our history to the last, in the hour of darkness and peril and need, the people will waken and listen to hear the hurrying hoofbeats of seed and the midnight message of Paul Revere. Obviously, Paul Revere was not the only guy that was warning the colonists that night that the British redcoats were on their way. He was not the only man out that evening. There were many riders. In fact, so many riders that when Paul Revere actually got back to Lexington, and after the British soldiers had left after the short battle, he looked around for a horse, and there were no more horses. There were so many riders out, there were no more horses left. So it was the poem itself is called Paul Revere's Ride, but there were a lot of people that evening riding. So to recap, you can see the fourth that evening or that day, because of course the British troops had been marching that previous night, basically been up since 8 a.m. and they've been marching up for 21 hours during that day, and 8 hours of that was under enemy fire. So basically, the total force engaged that evening was 1,500 of Gage's 4,000 troops. Of those, you can see that 73 were killed, 174 men were wounded, and 53 were captured. So of the 1,500, you're looking at about 300 who were basically killed or wounded. American casualties were a little bit less out of a larger force. But it wasn't just the number of wounded or killed that evening, and it wasn't just that the British had not really captured the arms and ammunition, the gunpowder they really wanted to, but that this was a major skirmish, a major battle. A lot of people had died, especially in many of these towns like Lexington. They were basically all related. There was, when the Puritans first moved into Massachusetts, there was actually a town size. You couldn't have more than, say, 300 people in your town or 400 people in your town. And that meant there was a lot of, basically, like maybe 10 or 20 families. If you count 10 or 20 families and you count not only the parents and the kids, but also their cousins and their uncles and all that, and their kids, etc. You get to about 400. So in many of these New England towns, you're basically just talking about extended families, which means when you have 8 people killed at Lexington, that affects a lot of families in Lexington. And of course, all those people are now very angry at the British government. So it's not just the battle, it's not just the British were not successful, the British troops were not successful, because of course at this point everyone's British, but the British troops were not successful. And it's not just that people were killed, but that this marks a turning point. Up until this time, you know, the British troops had gone to these areas, had not been successful, but basically there had been very few or no casualties. But now a corner has been turned. A match has been lit, and all those other metaphors. The Boston newspaper, the next day, you can see it says bloody butchery about what happens to the British troops. They call it the runaway flight of the regulars. That is basically saying the British troops ran away from the fight after killing all these innocent people. So that's not very good. So we often call that the shot heard around the world. And the shot was not heard around the world. And that would be against the laws of physics. I'm sorry. But what we mean is it's a pretty important time in history, because this time will mark a time where people basically stop thinking of themselves as British Americans, stop being loyal to the British government, and start thinking, what type of government would do this to us? And should we remain loyal to that type of government? So sometimes it's called the first battle of the American Revolutionary War. The shot heard round the world. Again, wasn't heard around the world, but it had ramifications. It had impacts that would be worldwide, because out of this battle comes the American Revolution, and out of the American Revolution comes the United States of America, and of course the United States of America has basically affected large portions of the world. So, all right, Lexington and Concord, the shot heard round the world.